Edvard Munch is a Norwegian-born expressionist painter. His best-known work, The Scream, has become one of the most iconic images of world art. In the late 20th century, he played a great role in German expressionism and the art form that later followed, namely because of the strong mental anguish that was displayed in many of the pieces that he created. Edvard Munch was born in Norway in 1863, and was raised in Christiania, known as Oslo today. He was related to famous painters and artists in their own right, Jacob Munch, painter, and Peter Munch, historian. Only a few years after he was born, Edvard Munch's mother died of tuberculosis in 1868, and he was raised by his father. Edvard's father suffered from mental illness, and this played a role in the way he and his siblings were raised. Their father raised them with the fears of deep-seated issues, which is part of the reason why the work of Edvard Munch took a deeper tone, and why the artist was known to have so many repressed emotions as he grew up. In 1885, Edvard Munch traveled to Paris, and was extremely influenced by impressionists such as Claude Monet, Edouard Manet, and followed by the post-impressionism artists Vincent van Gogh, Paul Cézanne, and Paul Gauguin. In fact, the main style of Munch's work is post-impressionism, and focused on this style. From about 1892 to 1908, Munch split most of his time between Paris and Berlin. It was in 1909 that he decided to return to his hometown and go back to Norway. During this period, much of the work that was created by Edvard Munch depicted his interest in nature, and it was also noted that the tones and colors that he used in these pieces did add more color and seemed a bit more cheerful than most of the previous works he had created in years past. The pessimistic toning, which was quite prominent in much of his earlier works, had faded quite a bit, and it seems he took more of a colorful, playful, and fun tone with the pieces that he was creating, as opposed to the dark and somber style which he tended to work with earlier on during the course of his career. From this period, up to his death, Edvard Munch remained in Norway, and much of his work that was created from this period on seemed to take on the similar, colorful approach which he had adopted since returning home in 1909. From this period, up to his death, Edvard Munch remained in Norway, and much of his work that was created from this period on seemed to take on the similar, colorful approach which he had adopted since returning home in 1909. Edvard Munch, who never married, called his paintings his children and hated to be separated from them. Living alone on his estate outside Oslo for the last 27 years of his life, increasingly revered and increasingly isolated, he surrounded himself with work that dated to the start of his long career. Upon his death in 1944, at the age of 80, the authorities discovered, behind locked doors on the second floor of his house, a collection of 1,008 paintings, 4,443 drawings and 15,391 prints, as well as woodcuts, etchings, lithographs, lithographic stones, woodcut blocks, copperplates and photographs. Yet in a final irony of his difficult life, Munch is famous today as the creator of a single image, which has obscured his overall achievement as a pioneering and influential painter and printmaker. Munch's The Scream is an icon of modern art, a Mona Lisa for our time. As Leonardo da Vinci evoked a Renaissance ideal of serenity and self-control, Munch defined how we see our own age, racked with anxiety and uncertainty. His painting of a sexless, twisted, fetal-faced creature, with mouth and eyes open wide in a shriek of horror, recreated a vision that had seized him as he walked one evening in his youth with two friends at sunset. As he later described it, the air turned to blood, and the faces of my comrades became a garish yellow-white. Vibrating in his ears he heard a huge endless scream course through nature. He made 2 oil paintings, 2 pastels and numerous prints of the image. The 2 paintings belong to Oslo's National Gallery and to the Munch Museum, also in Oslo. Both have been stolen in recent years, and the Munch Museums is still missing. The thefts have only added posthumous misfortune and notoriety to a life filled with both, and the added attention to the purloined image has further distorted the artist's reputation. With the aim of correcting the balance, a major retrospective of Munch's work, the first to be held in an American museum in almost 30 years, opened last month at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Everybody knows, but everybody doesn't know Munch, says Kynaston McShine, the MoMA curator-at-large who organized the exhibition. They all have the idea that they know Munch, but they really don't. The Munch who materializes in this show is a restless innovator whose personal tragedies, sicknesses and failures fed his creative work. "My fear of life is necessary to me, as is my illness," he once wrote. "Without anxiety and illness, I am a ship without a rudder. My sufferings are part of myself and my art. They are indistinguishable from me, and their destruction would destroy my art." Munch believed that a painter mustn't merely transcribe external reality but should record the impact a remembered scene had on his own sensibility. As demonstrated in a recent exhibition of self-portraits at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm and the Royal Academy of Arts in London, much of Munch's work can be seen as self-portraiture. Even for an artist, he was exceptionally narcissistic. Munch's work is like a visual autobiography, McShine observes. Although he began his artistic career as a student of Norwegian painter Christian Krogh, who advocated the realistic depiction of contemporary life known as naturalism, Munch developed a psychologically charged and expressive style to transmit emotional sensation. Indeed, by the time he raised his brush to the easel, he typically no longer paid attention to his model. "I do not paint what I see, but what I saw," he once explained. Influenced as a young man by his exposure in Paris to the work of Gauguin and Van Gogh, who both rejected the academic conventions of the official salon, he progressed toward simplified forms and blocks of intense color with the avowed purpose of conveying strong feelings. In early 1890, in a huff, Munch quit the class of an esteemed Parisian painting teacher who had criticized him for portraying a rosy brick wall in the green shades that appeared to him in a retinal afterimage. In ways that antagonized the contemporary art critics, who accused him of exhibiting a discarded half-rubbed-out sketch and mocked his random blobs of color, he would incorporate into his paintings graffiti-like scrawls, or thin his paint and let it drip freely. The radical simplicity of his woodcut technique, in which he often used only one brilliant color and exposed the grain of the wood on the print, can still seem startlingly new. For the woodcuts, he developed his own method, incising the image with rough broad strokes and cutting the finished woodblocks into sections that he inked separately. His printmaking style, as well as the bold composition and color palette of his paintings, would deeply influence the German expressionists of the early 20th century, including Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and August Macke. Characteristically, though, Munch shunned the role of mentor. He preferred to stand apart. He wanted to be regarded as a contemporary artist, not an old master, says Gerd Wall, senior curator at the Munch Museum. He embraced chance fearlessly. Visitors to his studio were shocked and they saw that he had left his paintings out of doors in all kinds of weather. From the first years, the criticism of Munch was that he didn't finish his paintings. They were sketches and starts, Wall says. This was true, if you compare them to paintings in the salon. But he wanted them to look unfinished. He wanted them to be raw and rough, and not smooth and shiny. It was emotion he wanted to depict. "It's not the chair that should be painted," he once wrote, "but what a person has felt at the sight of it." One of Munch's earliest memories was of his mother, confined with tuberculosis, gazing wistfully from her chair at the fields that stretched outside the window of their house in Christiania, now Oslo. She died in 1868, leaving Edvard, who was 5, his 3 sisters and younger brother in the care of her much older husband, Christian, a doctor imbued with a religiosity that often darkened into gloomy fanaticism. Edvard's Aunt Karen came to live with the family, but the boy's deepest affection resided with Sophie, his older sister. Her death 9 years later at age 15, also of tuberculosis, lacerated him for life. Dying, she asked to be lifted out of bed and placed in a chair. Munch, who painted many compositions of her illness and last days, kept that chair until his death. Today it is owned by the Munch Museum. Compounding Edvard's misery was his own fragile health. As Sue Prideaux recounts in her new biography, Edvard Munch, Behind the Scream, He had tuberculosis and spit blood as a boy. His father's expressed preference for the next world, an alarming trait in a physician, only amplified the son's sense of death's imminence. One of Munch's finest self-portraits, a lithograph of 1895, depicts his head and clerical-looking collar materializing out of a black background. A thin white band at the top of the work contains his name and the year, and a corresponding strip below features a skeletal arm. I inherited two of mankind's most frightful enemies. The heritage of consumption and insanity, illness and madness and death were the black angels that stood at my cradle, he wrote in an undated private journal. In a never-ending saga of woe, one of Edvard's sisters spent most of her life institutionalized for mental illness, and his one brother, who had seemed atypically robust for a Munch, died suddenly of pneumonia at 30. Only his youngest sister, Inger, who like him never married, survived into old age. Edvard's precocious talent was recognized early. How quickly his art, and his personality, evolved can be seen from two self-portraits. A small, 3/4 profile on cardboard, painted in 1881–82 when he was only 18, depicts the artist's classic good looks, straight nose, Cupid's bow mouth, strong chin, with a fine brush and academic correctness. 5 years later, Munch's palette knife work in a larger self-portrait is impressionistic and splotchy. His hair and throat blur into the background, his lowered gaze and out-thrust chin lend him an insolent air, and the red rims of his eyes suggest boozy, sleepless nights, the start of a long descent into alcoholism. For a full-length portrait in 1889 of Hans Jaeger, the nihilist at the heart of the bohemian crowd in Christiania with whom Munch increasingly fraternized, the artist posed the notorious writer in a slouch on a sofa with a glass tumbler on the table in front of him and a hat low on his forehead. Jaeger's head is aslant and his eyes jut forward in a pose both arrogant and dissolute. Along with psychological astuteness, the compelling portrait demonstrates Munch's awareness of recent developments in painting. The dappled blue and gray brushwork of Jaeger's coat suggests Impressionism, especially the work of Cézanne, which the Norwegian may have seen on trips to Paris in 1885 and 1889. For Christian Munch, who was struggling to pay the expenses of his son's education, Edvard's association with dubious companions was a source of anguish. Edvard, too, was torn. Though he lacked his father's faith in God, he had nonetheless inherited his sense of guilt. Reflecting later on his bohemian friends and their embrace of free love, he wrote, "God, and everything was overthrown, everyone raging in a wild, deranged dance of life, but I could not set myself free from my fear of life and thoughts of eternal life." His first sexual experience apparently took place in the summer of 1885, when he was 21, with Millie Thallo, the wife of a distant cousin. They would meet in the woods near the charming fishing village of Asgardstrand. He was maddened and thrilled while the relationship lasted and tormented and desolate when Millie ended it after 2 years. The theme of a forlorn man and a dominating woman fascinated Munch. In one of his most celebrated images, Vampire, 1893–94, a red-haired woman can be seen sinking her mouth into the neck of a disconsolate-looking lover, her tresses streaming over him like poisonous tendrils. In another major painting, his 1894 Ashes, a woman reminiscent of Millie confronts the viewer, her white dress unbuttoned to reveal a red slip, her hands raised to the sides of her head while a distraught lover holds his head in despair. Munch was in Paris in November 1889 when a friend delivered a letter to him. Verifying that it contained bad news, he bid the friend farewell and went alone to a nearby restaurant, deserted except for a couple of waiters, where he read that his father had died of a stroke. Although their relationship had been fraught, he didn't understand my needs. I didn't understand the things he prized most highly, Munch once observed. The death unhinged him. Now head of a financially pressed family, he was sobered by the responsibility and gripped by remorse that he had not been with his father when he died. Because of this absence, he could not release his feelings of grief into a painting of the death scene, as he had done when his mother and his sister Sophie died. Night in St. Cloud, painted in 1890, a moody, blue interior of his suburban Paris apartment, captures his state of mind. In it, a A shadowy figure in a top hat, his roommate, Danish poet Emanuel Goldstein, stares out a window at the bright lights on the Seine River. Evening light, streaming through a mullioned window, casts a symbolic pattern of a cross onto the floor, evoking the spirit of his devout father. Following his father's death, Munch embarked on the most productive, if most troubled, stage of his life. Dividing his time between Paris and Berlin, he undertook a series of paintings that he called the Frieze of Life. He produced 22 works as part of the series for a 1902 exhibition of the Frieze in Berlin. Suggestive of his state of mind, the paintings bore such titles as Melancholy, Jealousy, Despair, Anxiety, Death in the Sick Room and The Scream, which he painted in 1893. His style varies dramatically during this period, depending on the emotion he was trying to communicate in a particular painting. He turned to an Art Nouveau sultriness for Madonna, 1894–95, and a stylized, psychologically laden symbolism for Summer Night's Dream, 1893. In his superb self-portrait with Cigarette of 1895, painted while he was feverishly engaged with the Frieze of Life, he employed the flickering brushwork of Whistler, scraping and rubbing at the suit jacket so that his body appears as evanescent as the smoke that trails from the cigarette he holds smoldering near his heart. In Death in the Sick Room, a moving evocation of Sophie's death painted in 1893, he adopted the bold graphic outlines of Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Toulouse-Lautrec. In it, he and his sisters loom in the foreground, while his aunt and praying father attend to the dying girl, who is obscured by her chair. Across the vast space that divides the living siblings, portrayed as adults, from their dying sister, the viewer's eye is drawn to the vacated bed and useless medicines in the rear. A majority of the works which Edvard Munch created were referred to as the style known as symbolism. This is mainly because of the fact that the paintings he made focused on the internal view of the objects, as opposed to the exterior, and what the eye could see. Symbolist painters believed that art should reflect an emotion or idea rather than represent the natural world in the objective, quasi-scientific manner embodied by realism and impressionism. In painting, symbolism represents a synthesis of form and feeling, of reality and the artist's inner subjectivity. Along with Austrian artist Gustav Klimt, Edvard Munch is considered as the most prominent symbolist painters of 20th century. Many of Munch's works depict life and death scenes, love and terror, and the feeling of loneliness was often a feeling which viewers would note that his work patterns focused on. These emotions were depicted by the contrasting lines, the darker colors, blocks of color, somber tones, and a concise and exaggerated form, which depicted the darker side of the art which he was designing. Munch is often and rightly compared with Van Gogh, who was one of the first artists to paint what the French artist called the mysterious centers of the mind. But perhaps a more overreaching influence was Sigmund Freud, a very close contemporary. Freud explained much human behavior by relating it to childhood experiences. Munch saw his mother die of tuberculosis when he was 5, and his sister Sophie died of the same disease when he was 14. Munch gives the By the Deathbed and Death in the Sick Room a universal cast by not specifically depicting what he had witnessed. Several versions of the sick child are surely his sister. Edvard Munch passed away in 1944, in a small town which was just outside of his hometown in Oslo. Upon his death, the works which he had created were not given to family, but they were instead donated to the Norwegian government, and were placed in museums, in shows, and in various local public buildings in Norway. In fact, after his death, more than 1,000 paintings that Edvard Munch had created were donated to the government. In addition to the paintings that he had created during the course of his career, all other art forms he created were also donated to the government. A total of 15,400 prints were donated, 4,500 drawings and watercolor art was donated, and 6 sculptures which Edvard Munch had created were all turned over to the Oslo government, and were used as display pieces in many locations. Due to the fact that all of this work which Edvard Munch had created was donated to the Norwegian government, the country decided to build the Munch Museum of Art. This was done to commemorate his work, his life, and the generosity which he showed, in passing his artwork over to the government, so that it could be enjoyed by the general public, rather than be kept locked up by the family. Although the art which he did donate was spread throughout a number of museums and art exhibits, a majority of them were kept in Oslo. And most of the works which were donated by Munch were placed in the Munch Museum of Art, to commemorate the work he did, as well as the unique style and the distinct movements which he introduced to the world through the creations which he had crafted. In 1909, Munch returned to Norway, where he began work on an important series of murals for the Assembly Hall at Oslo University. Still in place, the Ala decorations, as the murals are known, signaled Munch's new determination to look on the bright side, in this case quite literally, with a centerpiece of a dazzling sun. In newly independent Norway, Munch was hailed as the national artist, much as the then recently deceased Henrik Ibsen and Edvard Grieg served, respectively, as national writer and composer. Along with his new fame came wealth, but not serenity. Maintaining his distance from an alternately adoring and scornful public, Munch withdrew to Eekli, an 11-acre estate on the outskirts of Oslo that he purchased in 1916 for a sum equivalent to the price of 2 or 3 of his paintings. He sometimes defended his isolation as necessary to produce his work. At other times, he implied it was needed to maintain his sanity. "The second half of my life has been a battle just to keep myself upright," he wrote in the early 1920s. At Eekli, Munch took up landscape painting, depicting the countryside and farm life around him, at first with joyous color, later in bleaker tones. He also returned to favorite images, producing new renditions of some of the frieze-of-life paintings. In his later years, Munch supported his surviving family members financially and communicated with them by mail, but chose not to visit them. He spent much of his time in solitude, documenting the afflictions and indignities of his advancing years. When he was stricken with a nearly fatal influenza in the Great Pandemic of 1918-19, he recorded his gaunt, bearded figure in a series of self-portraits as soon as he could pick up a brush. In 1930, after a blood vessel burst in his right eye and impaired his vision, he painted, in such works as Self-Portrait During the Eye Disease, the clot as it appeared to him, a large, irregular purple sphere. Sometimes he gave the sphere a head and sharp beak, like a demonic bird of prey. Eventually, it flew off, his vision returned to normal. In Self-Portrait Between the Clock and the Bed, which dates from 1940 to 42, not long before Munch's death, we can see what had become of the man who, as he wrote, hung back from the dance of life. Looking stiff and physically awkward, he stands wedged between a grandfather clock and a bed, the sick child, as if apologizing for taking up so much space. The sick child is one of Munch's earliest works, on a wall behind considered him, by the artist children a breakthrough for setting the tone for his early career, in which death, loss, anxiety, madness, and the preoccupations of a troubled soul were his chief subject matter. Devoted to his deceased sister, Johann Sophie, the painting depicts the bedridden 15-year-old with a grieving woman beside her, the latter probably a representation of Munch's mother who had preceded Sophie in death, also from tuberculosis, 11 years prior. The rough brushstrokes, scratched surface, and melancholic tones of this painting all reveal a highly personal memorial. The work was highly criticized for its unfinished appearance when first exhibited, but nonetheless championed by Munch's spiritual mentor, Hans Jaeger, as a masterful achievement. 1890. Night in St. Cloud. If The Sick Child is a loving tribute to Munch's favorite sister, Johann Sophie, Night in St. Cloud is a far more complex and darker memorial to the artist's father who had died the previous year. Created not long after Munch's arrival in Paris, Night in St. Cloud reveals the immediate influence of post-impressionists Van Gogh and Toulouse-Lautrec, whose many portraits of solitary figures or empty rooms inform this canvas. Munch's tribute to his father is composed of a darkened, seemingly hallowed room bathed in crepuscular light, indeed a space occupied only by shadows and stillness. The rendition is befitting of their tense relationship. In other paintings that focus on death, Munch made the subject physically present. However, in this instance, Munch's father's passing evokes only a sense of cool abandon. Notably, this work presages Pablo Picasso's Blue Period. 1893. The Scream. The significance of Munch's The Scream within the annals of modern art cannot be overstated. It stands among an exclusive group, including Van Gogh's Starry Night, 1889, Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, and Matisse's Red Studio, 1911, comprising the quintessential works of modernist experiment and lasting innovation. The fluidity of Munch's lateral and vertical brushwork echoes the sky and clouds in Starry Night, yet one may also find the aesthetic elements of Fauvism, Expressionism, and perhaps even Surrealism arising from this same surface. The setting of The Scream was suggested to the artist by a walk along a road overlooking the city of Oslo, apparently upon Munch's arrival at, or departure from, a mental hospital where his sister, Laura Catherine, had been interned. It is unknown whether the artist observed an actual person in anguish, but this seems unlikely. As Munch later recalled, "I was walking down the road with two friends when the sun set. Suddenly, the sky turned as red as blood. I stopped and leaned against the fence, shivering with fear. Then I heard the enormous, infinite scream of nature." This is one of two painted versions of the Scream that Munch rendered around the turn of the 20th century. The other, circa 1910, is currently in the collections of the Munch Museum, Oslo. In addition to these painted versions, there is a version in pastel and a lithograph.